I was around 19, camping with my buddy up in the mountains of North Carolina. It was early fall, the kind of cool but not cold nights that make you want to sit close to the fire and just listen to the woods around you. We had decided to hike a few miles up the mountain from the campsite where his grandparents were staying. Their spot was down by a gravel road and had a few other campers around, but we wanted something more private, something off the beaten path. So instead of sticking to any marked trails, we made our way up through a small stream that cut through the woods. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks was constant, like white noise, and it mixed with the quiet hum of the forest settling into night. After hiking for about 2 hours, we found a big rock near the stream, the kind of rock that looks like it could have been there for 100 years or more, half buried and moss-covered. We used that rock as the backbone for our shelter, making a lean-to with some fallen branches and leaves. Something simple but enough to block the wind and keep the worst of the weather off us. We set up just before dark, and the last of the daylight was fading behind the trees, turning the sky into a deep shade of blue that soon went black. We got a small fire going, enough to warm us but nothing big. Just some coals left now, glowing red and orange, low and slow. Everything was perfect in those first few hours. No bugs biting, no strange sounds, just the peacefulness of the forest and the quiet chatter between me and my buddy. We talked about everything and nothing: school, girls, what we wanted to do with our lives, while the fire slowly burned down. The stars started to come out, and I remember looking up and thinking how far away from everything we were. No streetlights, no cars, no other people. Just us, the woods, and the sound of that stream nearby. But then after midnight, something changed. It was the kind of dark where you can barely see your own hand if you hold it out in front of your face and look up at the sky. The trees around us were just black shapes, and the only light was from the dying embers in the fire pit. I was lying on the outside edge of the lean-to, watching out into the woods. My buddy was closer to the rock, fast asleep and snoring softly, completely unaware of what I was about to see. Out of nowhere, I caught a flicker of light in the trees, just a tiny flash. At first, I thought maybe it was my eyes playing tricks on me, or a reflection from the fire somewhere deep in the woods. But then it appeared again, in the same spot, bright and steady for a moment before disappearing. I focused on it, trying to figure out what it was. My first thought was that maybe, somehow, we'd gotten close to a road, and it was a car's headlights shining through the trees. That made sense, right? The light was too steady and strong to be an animal or a flashlight flicking around. But then the light moved. It flipped in the air almost like a stunt. It wasn't a steady beam coming from far away, but something smaller, moving with a strange, deliberate motion. It wasn't erratic like a person walking around with a flashlight. It was smooth, fast, and unnatural. It flipped again, almost like it was doing tricks, hovering for a moment and then darting sideways through the trees. I was frozen, not moving, heart pounding. My mind was trying to decide what it could be. A flashlight? Someone lost in the woods? Some kind of prank? Or something else I wasn't ready to think about? My friend kept snoring behind me. He was completely out cold. No idea what was going on. I didn't want to wake him up for fear of making a noise and attracting whatever that was out there. I stayed quiet, watching the spot where the light had been, waiting to see if it would come back. After what felt like 10 minutes, the strange light disappeared. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then, out of nowhere, a second light appeared, right at my feet. I nearly jumped. It was like a glowing orb, about the size of a golf ball. But this light wasn't like a flashlight or a firefly. It was pure white, almost perfect, like it was made of light itself rather than reflecting it. It didn't shine on anything around it, didn't cast shadows. It just was. The orb moved slowly, silently, in a straight line from where it had appeared at the base of our shelter, past my feet, past my knees, all the way up past my head, before disappearing into the darkness behind me. I couldn't move. I felt like my body was frozen solid. My heart was racing, but my muscles refused to respond. For all I knew, this thing was studying me or scanning me like a piece of equipment. Time slowed down. For what felt like 15 minutes, I sat there, unable to breathe fully, unable to blink properly, with my eyes locked on where the orb had vanished. After a long pause, it reappeared near where it started, just hovering in place. But this time, it didn't flicker or move. It just stayed lit, steady and bright, like it was waiting. Then, my buddy shifted in his sleep and rolled over. He was close enough that when I gently nudged him with my elbow, trying not to make any sound, he woke up immediately. I whispered for him to look out into the woods where I'd seen the lights. His breathing quickened, and I could tell he was on edge. After a few moments, I heard him whisper, "What the fuck is that?" There was no way either of us could deny what we were seeing. The light moved slowly through the trees, drifting and dancing just beyond the edge of our shelter. Then more lights appeared, two this time higher up on the hill behind us. They flitted and hovered, moving together but not quite in sync. The way they moved was unlike anything we had ever seen in the woods. No bugs, no animals, no human carrying a flashlight. These lights were something else. We stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the strange orbs float silently through the trees. We didn't speak much. There was no point. Neither of us knew what to say. It felt like watching something that didn't belong in our world. Something that should have scared us to the bone, but instead filled us with a strange, tense curiosity. They stayed until about an hour before dawn. As the first light of morning began to creep into the sky, the orbs disappeared, slipping away into the trees as quietly as they had come. The woods went completely silent again, just the sound of birds starting to sing and the gentle rush of the stream nearby. Once the sun was fully up, we both crashed, passing out for a few hours without saying a word about what we'd seen. When we finally woke, the feeling of that night stayed with me like a weight in my chest. We packed up our shelter and made the slow hike back down to the grandparents' campsite, the woods feeling less friendly in the light of day. Even now, years later, I still have no idea what those lights were. No one ever explains or confirms anything like that. They weren't fireflies, those don't glow white, steady, or move the way those orbs did. And the idea of a car's headlights or a flashlight is even more impossible given the way the lights moved and appeared right next to me. No trails, no roads, nothing but deep, thick forest for miles around. When I finally fell asleep that morning after the sun was fully up, I had a dream replaying the night. Only this time, when the orb came toward me, instead of just letting it scan me, I sat up and asked, "What are you?" And then, without warning, the light shifted from white to red and flew straight at my face before I woke up with a start. I can't say what it was. Maybe some kind of natural phenomenon we don't understand yet. Maybe some kind of unknown animal or insect with bioluminescent abilities we've never seen before. Maybe something else. But whatever it was real. It wasn't a trick of my mind or a hallucination. I still think about that night when I'm out in the woods. How something was there watching us just as we were watching it. And how, for a little while, the dark wasn't quite so empty or silent. The sun was already beating down hard when we arrived deep in the California desert. My boss, his dog, a colleague, and I had planned this hunting and survival camping trip for weeks. We wanted to test ourselves, no luxuries, just the basics. We brought only what we could carry: water, food for the dog, a little emergency food for ourselves, and communication gear. No fancy supplies, no heavy backpacks. We rented a 4x4 truck to get as far in as we could, and then we'd go on foot to set up camp. By the time we found the spot, the truck was barely making it through the dusty, rocky dirt roads. The desert around us was vast and harsh, with nothing but dry bushes, cracked earth, and distant rocky hills. The nearest town was at least an hour away, and the heat was already brutal. It was late morning when we finally stopped. We unloaded our gear quickly, knowing that the sun wouldn't wait for us to get comfortable. Setting up camp was rough. The ground was hard, full of sharp stones and thorny plants. We picked a small clearing surrounded by some sparse scrub, hoping it would offer at least a little shade. We put up the tents, arranged our supplies, and double-checked the firearms. Each of us had a rifle. My boss's dog carried a small pack with some dog food and water in it. We knew the desert could be unforgiving, but the plan was clear. Hunt during the cooler parts of the day, rest during the peak heat, and keep an eye on each other. The first day passed slow. The heat was worse than I expected. The sun made everything shimmer, and even the smallest movements felt exhausting. We tried tracking some animals, but everything was dry and barren. We found no signs of rabbits or deer, just scattered lizards and the occasional buzzard circling above. By the end of the day, none of us had caught anything. That night, the desert got cold fast. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset, but the wind picked up, blowing dust and sand over the camp. We made a small fire and ate some of the emergency food we brought, mostly canned goods and jerky. The dog seemed restless, sniffing around, occasionally growling softly at the darkness beyond the campfire's reach. I didn't think much of it. The dog was probably reacting to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night. The second day was harder. The heat was relentless, and our water supply was shrinking. None of us were used to going without proper food, and by then all we had left was water and the dog's food. We went out hunting again in the early morning, moving slowly through the scrub and rocky hills, rifles ready. But again, nothing. No tracks, no sounds, no signs of life beyond the occasional buzzard and a few desert rats. That evening, when we returned to camp, something caught my eye. Scattered around the area near our tents were what looked like mountain lion droppings. Large, dark, and full of fur. My boss knelt down to examine them closely. He said it was definitely mountain lion scat. We weren't exactly scared, but the thought of a big cat nearby added a new edge to the situation. We all made sure our firearms were close at hand. The dog's behavior changed that night. He was tense, alert, ears perked up, and growling softly at the shadows beyond the firelight. We tried to ignore it and get some rest, but sleep didn't come easily. The heat had drained us, and hunger gnawed in the back of our minds. The third day was the worst. The heat was unbearable by midday, and the lack of solid food was making everyone irritable and weak. We stuck close to camp, hoping to catch something nearby or at least find fresh tracks. But nothing showed up. The dog was restless all day, pacing and whining. That evening, we decided to sit close to the campfire and rest. We hadn't eaten solid food in 3 days. The emergency food was almost gone, and we were surviving mostly on water. We all sat close to the fire, trying to stay alert. My boss was cleaning his rifle, my colleague was staring into the flames, and I was watching the horizon. Then my colleague, suddenly froze. His eyes were fixed on a spot just beyond the firelight, staring hard into the darkness. "Look," he said quietly, pointing. There, about 50 yards away, 2 pairs of eyes were glowing faintly in the dark. We all turned to look. The eyes were low to the ground, close together, shining a dull yellow-green in the moonlight. They didn't blink, didn't move much. It was as if whatever they belonged to was just sitting there, watching us. The dog suddenly went wild. He barked and growled like I've never heard before, his hackles raised, teeth bared. He was fixated on those eyes, pulling at the leash, trying to get closer. We scrambled to get back into the tents. Heart pounding, I grabbed my rifle and pulled the tent flap closed behind me, listening to the dog's furious barking outside. We stayed quiet and still inside our tents, rifles raised and ready. For what felt like forever, maybe 10 minutes, the eyes stayed where they were. Occasionally, we saw movement, just slight shifts in the darkness, but no sounds other than the dog's barking and the crackling fire. We didn't fire. Killing a mountain lion out here wouldn't have been a good idea. It might have drawn other animals, or worse, left us stranded with no protection. So we waited. The standoff stretched on, tense and silent except for the dog's low growls. Eventually, the eyes blinked and turned away. The creatures, whatever they were, moved off quietly into the darkness, disappearing from sight. The dog stopped barking but stayed on edge. After that night, none of us slept well. We packed up everything in the early morning, keeping one person on guard with a loaded rifle at all times. The truck was a small fortress, doors locked, windows rolled up tight. The dog was still nervous, pacing inside the cab. We left as fast as we could without making noise. On the drive back, we were silent. No one wanted to talk about what happened, but the feeling lingered. Was it really mountain lions? Or had the heat and hunger played tricks on our minds? The dog's reaction was the only thing that convinced us it was real. Even now, years later, the memory haunts me. We were deep in the desert, far from help, with nothing but our guns and each other. Those eyes in the dark, watching us without moving, are burned into my mind. I've never felt that scared before or since. It wasn't some story from a movie or a ghost tale, it was real, and we were lucky to get out alive. It was sometime in mid-August, about 4 years ago now. I was stationed in northern British Columbia during a multinational army training exercise. The kind of place where the air smells like wet pine and diesel, where the trees crowd around you like a wall of dark green and the nights are as black as the inside of your eyelids. We were working joint operations with some American units that had come up to train with us. During the day, it was all movement drills, weapons handling, simulated contact scenarios, and a bunch of yelling from people higher in rank than me. At night, once we'd wrapped everything up, we'd head back to our bivouac site, a small, well-trodden clearing where we pitched our crew tents and tried to catch whatever sleep we could before doing it all over again. The Americans had set up their own site about 2 kilometers to the southeast. Not far in the grand scheme of things, but far enough that we weren't within shouting distance or line of sight. That left our camp quiet, aside from the usual rustle of trees and the occasional snore from a tent. For security and safety, especially out in a place like that, we always had 2 people on sentry. One to keep an eye on the weapons, fuel, or gear, and another to watch for fire or any potential wildlife problems. We didn't expect anything major, but protocol's protocol. You don't skip it. My luck had me pulled for the 0200 to 0330 shift. That time of night where your body is convinced you should be asleep and does everything it can to drag you under. I remember being woken up around 0130 by the guy on the earlier shift. He nudged me in the ribs with the butt of his rifle, whispered something, and handed off the duty log. I grunted, pulled on my smock, and stepped out into the night. It was cool, not cold, and the sky above was overcast, which made everything around us darker than usual. Even with NVGs, the trees looked like black vertical smears, and our camp was just a loose pattern of lumps and canvas shadows. My fire team partner, a guy named Ray, was already up and walking the perimeter on the opposite side of the site. We didn't talk, no need to. We weren't in a combat zone, but the silence helped us stay sharp, or at least feel like we were doing something serious. Plus, at that hour, you don't really feel like chatting. The first half hour was uneventful, just the usual. The creaking of trees in the wind, the occasional distant snap of a twig, and the low, dull sound of someone snoring in one of the crew tents. I made a slow walk of the site, keeping close to the gear pile and fuel jerrys, just to be sure everything was in order. Nothing out of place. No lights in the tree line. No movement. Just darkness and a damp, earthy smell in the air. About 45 minutes in, something shifted. I didn't notice it all at once. It was like a slow tightening in the air. The kind of thing you only realize after a minute or two of walking around and thinking, why does this feel off? The sounds I'd gotten used to. The trees creaking, the insects humming, even the distant snores. They weren't gone, but they felt muted, like hearing them through thick insulation or from underwater. The closest comparison I can make is how it feels after a heavy snowfall, where all the sounds get absorbed and even your own breathing seems too loud. I stopped walking and just stood there for a bit, trying to listen. The air felt still. Not dead, just unnaturally quiet. There wasn't any wind now. The trees were motionless. I remember breathing through my nose, real slow, and holding the grip of my unloaded C7 rifle a little tighter. Not because I expected to use it, but because holding it made me feel a little more grounded. That's when I started to hear the whispering. It wasn't constant, and it wasn't coming from one spot. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, maybe leaves rustling, but there was no wind. Then I thought maybe someone had woken up and was talking inside one of the tents, but the sound wasn't coming from the tents. It was coming from the woods, from the trees just beyond the edge of our camp's perimeter. I squinted into the dark, couldn't see anything. The whispering didn't sound aggressive or angry. It wasn't even clear enough to understand. It was like the hushed voice of someone trying to tell a secret, but not quite loud enough for you to catch the words. And it wasn't constant. It would come in a soft rush, stop, then come again a few seconds later, a little farther to the left or right. My first instinct was to crouch low and get behind one of the supply crates. Not out of panic, just out of instinct. Training. If something's making a noise in the woods, you don't stand in the open waiting for it. You get small. You observe. I stayed crouched for maybe 30 seconds, listening. Nothing but that occasional whispering, moving a little here, a little there, like someone pacing or circling just out of sight. I debated radioing Ray, but I didn't want to make a fuss over nothing. Could have been the wind messing with my head. Could have been an animal. Hell, it could have been one of the American troops dicking around trying to spook us. They were known for pulling stunts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't any of those things. Eventually, I pulled my flashlight from my belt kit, took a breath, and flicked it on. I swept it across the treeline right to left. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The beam caught the fog of my breath in the cold air. I held it steady for a few more seconds, listening. The whispering had stopped. That silence hit harder than the whispering. It was like the moment you turn off a fan and suddenly realize how loud it had been. After a moment, I shut off the flashlight. The second the beam disappeared, I heard footsteps behind me. Soft ones, deliberate. I turned fast. It was just Ray, walking up from the far side of camp. He didn't say anything. He just nodded at me, like he'd seen the light and wanted to check in. We stood near the fuel pile for a bit, both of us scanning the treeline. Nothing moved. I remember looking at his face in the faint ambient light. He looked unsettled, not scared, just on edge, like he could feel the same tension in the air I did. He stayed near me for the rest of the shift. We didn't talk, just kept scanning. The whispering never came back. By the time 0330 rolled around, the next pair came to relieve us. We handed off the duty log and briefed them with a quick, nothing significant. Neither of us mentioned the whispering, not because we were afraid to, but because we couldn't explain it. It wasn't a reportable event. There was no visual contact, no confirmed movement, no incident, just a feeling and a sound. That's not enough to log. The next day, I casually asked around, seeing if anyone had been out of the tent at night or heard anything weird. Nothing. The Americans hadn't come near our site, and none of our own had left their tents. No one else mentioned hearing anything odd. I thought about it on and off the next couple of days. Every time we had a night shift, I'd be extra alert. But nothing like that ever happened again. No whispering, no weird silence, just normal quiet nights in the bush. I've chalked it up to either some kind of prank or my mind messing with me. Maybe fatigue, maybe the environment playing tricks. After all, being tired in the woods at night, on edge, can do things to your head. Your senses get sharper, but not always more accurate. Sound carries differently out there. The human brain wants to make sense of things it doesn't understand. Still, it stuck with me. It wasn't the whispering that left the mark. It was the silence before and after. That feeling of being watched, of being in the presence of something you couldn't place. The sound wasn't the scary part. The not knowing was. To this day, I don't have an explanation. It wasn't paranormal. I don't believe in that. I believe in stress. I believe in suggestion and the power of an uneasy mind. But I also believe that the bush has its own way of reminding you that you're not in control out there. That even when you think you're safe, when you think you know what's going on, there's always something just beyond the edge of the light, just out of sight, reminding you how small you are in a place like that. It's been years now, and I've done plenty of night shifts since then. Some in worse places, but that night in northern BC stuck with me more than most. Not because anything happened, but because, for a brief stretch of time, it felt like something almost did. And sometimes almost is worse. I had been camping alone in the mountains for several days. The days had been quiet, crisp, and mostly uneventful, just the way I liked it. There was something comforting about the silence of the woods, especially up in higher elevations where the wind is the only real company. I'd been following a rough loop that took me up a ridge line, through patches of pine and spruce, across meadows still damp from the season's last melt. and into a narrow basin tucked far enough away that I hadn't seen another soul in days. I'd set up camp near the edge of a tree line on the fourth evening, after a steady, cold wind started to pick up across the open ridge. I found a good, level patch just under a thick stand of trees, with the slope gently rising behind me and falling off in front toward a narrow drainage. There was a bit of shelter from the wind there. I pitched my tent facing downhill, set up my little fire, and cooked some dried soup and rice, grateful for the hot food. The air already had a bite to it. The weather had been holding, but you could feel change coming. The wind had that soft roar, like distant surf, and the smell in the air wasn't quite right. It had that sharp edge that only comes before snow. That night, I turned in earlier than usual. I was tired from the long hike and could feel it in my legs. My routine was simple. Clean up the cook gear, double-check my bear bag was tied up and well away from camp, and make sure everything was zipped up tight. I crawled into my sleeping bag, adjusted my ground pad, and lay there for a while listening to the wind brushing through the trees. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point during the night, I came awake suddenly. I didn't sit up or move at first. I just opened my eyes and stared at the roof of my tent, listening. It wasn't the wind that woke me. It was a sound right outside the tent, a kind of slow, deliberate noise, like something moving softly along the side of the tent wall. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Sometimes when you're camping alone for a while, your mind tries to fill in the silence. But then I heard it again. It sounded like sniffing. The sound was low and slow, like something inhaling just inches from the nylon wall. I could hear the air being drawn in, right near my head, then again down near my feet. Then nothing. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, frozen. My first thought was bear. Maybe a coyote, even a mountain lion, though they're not usually bold like that. My second thought was that I should be ready. I reached out slowly and felt for the side pocket of the tent, where I kept my sidearm in a soft holster. I didn't move fast. I didn't want to make noise. I found the grip, eased it out, and held it tight under the sleeping bag. My heart was thudding. The tent felt smaller, tighter. I listened again, ears straining for any other noise. I didn't hear footfalls, no crunching of twigs, just the steady hum of wind, and then silence. I waited. 5 minutes, maybe 10. I don't know exactly. Then it happened again. That same sniffing sound, slow and strange. It moved from one corner of the tent to the other, like something checking each edge. This time it sounded closer, more real. I could hear the faintest brushing sound along the fabric, like whatever it was had brushed against it with fur or maybe a nose. I was wide awake now, my senses dialed up to 10. Still no footsteps, still no growl or movement in the brush, just that sound. Then silence again. At that point, I knew I couldn't just lie there waiting. If it was an animal, it might leave, or it might not. And if it wasn't, well, I didn't let myself follow that thought too far. I decided to take a look. I slowly reached for the flashlight clipped above the tent door. My fingers were stiff from the cold. The temperature had dropped more than I expected. I unzipped the top of the bag, sat up quietly, and made my way to the tent's zipper. I didn't rush it. I unzipped the door as slowly and silently as I could, handgun ready in one hand, flashlight in the other. When the door flap opened, a rush of cold air hit me. I poked my head out and clicked on the light. Snow. The beam lit up the air in front of me like a white tunnel. Snowflakes were falling, big and slow and thick. They drifted lazily through the cone of light like dust in an attic. I panned the beam slowly to the left, then the right, checking the area just outside the tent. Nothing. No tracks. No animal. No movement. I stood there for a while, just scanning. The snow had already started to cover the ground, and it took me a second to realize it had probably been falling for a while. The ground was patchy white, soft with a fresh layer. I listened carefully. There was no more sniffing, no breathing, nothing but the wind in the branches and the sound of snow settling. I crouched down and looked along the sides of the tent, checking for marks, paw prints, any sign that something had walked around it. Again, nothing. Just a few leaves trapped under a thin blanket of snow. And that's when it hit me. The snow had started to build up on the side of the tent. It had drifted and stuck to the fabric, especially on the windward side. Every few minutes, enough would gather to slide down the sloped wall of the tent in a thin, soft sheet. It made a sound that was quiet, slow, and breathy, like something dragging lightly down the side, almost exactly like what I had heard, especially in the dead silence of the night, when your ears are already searching for danger. I sat back on my heels and let out a long breath. It was just snow, not an animal, not a person, just snow piling up and sliding off as the tent warmed from my body heat and the wind shifted. All that panic, the pounding heart, the drawn weapon, all of it triggered by something so simple. I stood up outside the tent for a while, letting the cold calm me down. The snow was beautiful in a way. It had started sticking to the trees, turning the branches white, muting the forest even more than usual. It was silent in the way only snow-covered woods can be. The light from my headlamp caught the flakes as they drifted down, and I could almost feel the pressure ease out of my chest. I re-zipped the tent, put my flashlight away, laid the handgun back in the corner of the tent, and climbed into my bag. I was cold now, but more relaxed. Still alert, but not scared anymore. I adjusted my position and stared at the ceiling for a long while, listening to the sound of snow slipping off the side of the tent again. Now that I knew what it was, the sound was almost soothing. I didn't fall asleep right away. I kept replaying how real the fear had been, how the silence can make anything sound closer than it is, and how in the backcountry, especially alone, your mind is always tuned to the idea that something might go wrong. But not everything is danger. Not every sound is a threat. Eventually, I did fall asleep. The snow kept falling through the night. By morning, there were maybe 5 inches on the ground. The whole forest looked new, freshly erased and repainted. I made coffee outside the tent, boots crunching softly in the snow, and laughed quietly to myself about the night before. What had felt like the beginning of a nightmare had just been snow. And in some way, that made me appreciate it even more. In the wilderness, the mind is always testing the line between caution and imagination. That night reminded me how easily we can mistake one for the other. But it also reminded me how important it is to stay calm, listen, think it through. Sometimes the scariest sounds are just the quiet ones you didn't expect. We started out just after 10 in the morning. The sky was overcast, but not in a threatening way, just a typical Lake District day. Thick gray above, low wind, the kind of weather that makes you keep a jacket in your pack but not on your back. I was hiking with my mate, Andrew. We'd both done plenty of walking before, but nothing graded. This was our first attempt at something even remotely technical. Striding edge on Helvellyn. A classic route. A glacial arête, narrow in places with steep drops on either side. It's what they call a grade 1 scramble. Nothing that needs ropes, but it's not just a walk in the park either. We parked in Glenridding and set off up the trail. Everything felt sharp and crisp, like the air was holding its breath. The path took us up past the stone walls and green fields, winding through the bracken. Sheep wandered off lazily as we passed. I remember feeling excited, not nervous exactly, but aware that this was going to be a different kind of hike. Something to talk about afterwards. The plan was simple. Make the ridge, follow it along to the summit, and then down Swirl Edge to the other side. There was a pub we'd picked out on the map, one we were hoping to reach by 3. We joked that we'd earn our pie and pint today. It was a good feeling, setting off on something new. You only get that first time once. We passed a few other hikers on the way up. The usual hellos and lovely day for it sort of thing. There was an older couple taking their time, a group of lads with walking poles who looked like they knew what they were doing, and one woman on her own. She stood out because of her bright red rucksack. It looked nearly new, the kind you see in adverts. She was blonde, maybe mid-30s, and she gave off this confident energy. We chatted briefly, just the 3 of us, near a bend in the trail before the ridge. Talked about the weather, how the cloud base seemed to be dropping fast, how it might close in once we gained elevation. She asked if we'd done Striding Edge before. We said no, but we'd read up on it. She had too. That was the last time we saw her. It was probably around 11:30 when we hit the ridge itself. The path narrows there, turns from a trail into a spine of rock. Fog had started to form below us in the valleys, curling up like steam. The climb brought us above the dew point, and just like that, we were in it. Not mist, fog, thick, like walking into cotton. I could barely see Andrew 10 feet ahead of me. Everything was gray and still, except for the sound of boots scraping on rock and our own breathing. It wasn't raining, but the moisture hung in the air. Our jackets were damp within minutes. We kept moving, slowly. We knew the path was tight and we didn't want to push our luck. That's the thing about striding edge. It's not technically hard, but the drops are real. Slipping in the wrong spot doesn't mean a twisted ankle. It means a fall of 100 feet or more. You have to take your time. There were moments when we stopped just to listen. The world was silent. Fog does that, it eats sound. You're aware of your own heartbeat, the squeak of your pack straps, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Every now and then the wind would shift and give us a glimpse of the drop to our left or right, sheer cliffs fading into white. I remember a point where I had to climb down a little chimney, maybe 6 feet deep, with a narrow ledge at the bottom. I passed my pack down to Andrew before easing myself in. The rock was slick with condensation. One misstep and that would have been it. But we were careful, steady, every foot placed with thought. It took longer than we'd expected, but we made the summit around 1:15. The fog was still thick, but we knew the path down was easier. Swirl edge is kinder than striding. As we descended, the fog began to lift. By the time we reached the bottom, we could see the valley floor again. Sunlight broke through in patches, lighting up fields and lakes in the distance. It felt like coming out the other side of something, like being released. We made it to the pub around 2:10, not a minute too soon. My legs were trembling a little from the concentration and effort. Nothing dramatic, just the aftershock of something that demanded your full focus for hours. We walked in, still in our hiking gear, damp jackets rolled and tied to our packs, boots caked with grit. The place was warm, wooden, and smelled of ale and roast meat, the kind of pub that seems to exist only at the end of a long walk. We both ordered the same thing, steak pie and a pint of bitter. Sat down by the window, felt good. We didn't talk much at first, just that satisfied silence of two people who've done something hard and now get to enjoy the reward. I remember the first sip of beer, cold, sharp, perfect. It was then the barkeep came over. Older guy, probably mid-50s, friendly but with that kind of local directness you get up north. "You two come over from Helvellyn just now?" he asked. We nodded. Striding edge. "Yeah," I said. "Just got down. Bit foggy up top." He paused. Then, almost casually, "You see a woman on the trail? Blonde. Mid-30s, maybe. Red Rucksack." I looked at Andrew. He looked at me. "Yeah," I said. "Talked to her for a bit, maybe near the halfway point up." "Why?" The barkeep didn't answer right away. He looked down, then back at us. "She didn't make it." I thought I hadn't heard him right. "Didn't make what?" "She fell," he said quietly. "Off the ridge. Narrow part. Someone found her pack below, near the tarn. Called it in. Mountain rescues up there now." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My mind went back to her face, her smile. She'd seemed calm, prepared, just like us. We'd told her about the fog, warned her it was thick, but it hadn't seemed like a big deal then, just part of the day, part of the mountain. "She must have gone up after us," Andrew said. "Likely," the barkeep said. "Coroner'll figure it out. But odds are, well, you were probably the last ones to speak to her." It hit me all at once. The weight of it. We'd stood on the same ground, laughed even, and now she was gone. A misstep, maybe half a foot in the wrong place, and she'd fallen. Over 100 feet. I thought about how careful we'd been, how many times I'd hesitated, checked my footing, took a breath before moving. It had felt hard but manageable. But it didn't take much. One slip, that's all it took. I couldn't finish the pie. It sat there cooling while I stared out the window. People came and went, couple with a dog. Another pair of hikers, red-faced and smiling. Life kept moving. But in the back of my mind, I kept seeing that bright red rucksack. It stayed with me for days, then weeks. Every time I packed my own gear, I saw her pack. Every time I looked at a weather forecast, I remembered the fog, how it swallowed the world, how silent it had been. I didn't talk about it much, not right away. What could I say? That we'd met a woman, shared a few words, and then learned she died within the hour? It didn't feel like my story to tell, but it stayed in me, not like a ghost story, not something supernatural, just real, heavy. A reminder that nature doesn't care how prepared you are or how friendly the trail might seem. Sometimes when I'm out hiking, I think about her. Not constantly, but in those quiet moments when I'm alone and the wind picks up or the cloud moves in fast. I wonder if she felt afraid, if she realized she'd lost footing before she fell, or if it was over in an instant. I hope it was the latter. I hope it was quick. Helvellyn is still beautiful. Striding Edge is still there, narrow and sharp. People still walk it every day. Most of them make it across just fine. But every so often, someone doesn't. And it's not because they did something wrong. It's just the nature of the thing. We walk these places because they're wild, because they make us feel small and alive. But they're not safe. Not really. And that's part of the deal. That's the price we pay sometimes for the view, for the silence, for that feeling at the end, when you sit down with a pint and remember what it was like to stand on a ridge with the world falling away on either side. I'll always remember that day, not because it was my first grade 1 scramble, not because of the fog, not even because of the pie I didn't finish, but because someone else didn't come back. We don't get to choose what sticks with us, but some things do. That red rucksack, her voice, the way the fog swallowed the trail. That's mine now. Carry it, quietly, like a stone in my pocket. I grew up way out in rural Alabama, down a dirt road that would turn to mud with just a bit of rain. My family had a good stretch of land, fields, woods, and old trails that twisted off into nowhere. The kind of place where the night is so quiet it gets loud, if that makes sense. You hear everything, even your own thoughts. Sometimes I miss it. The stillness, the space, how far away everything felt. But I'm a gamer now, and that kind of quiet doesn't work so well with needing good internet. Back when I was around 12, me and my best friend at the time decided we were finally ready to camp by ourselves. We'd been talking about it for weeks, making plans and packing snacks and arguing about which horror movies were the scariest. It was early winter, not full-on cold yet, but cold enough that the bugs were gone and you had to bundle up at night. That time of year when the air feels clean and sharp, and the sky's always clearer than you remember it. We picked a spot right at the edge of the woods behind the far field, not more than 500 or 600 yards from my house. From the edge of the tree line, you could still see the back porch light if you turned and squinted just right. It felt far enough to matter, to prove something, but still close enough that we could bolt back if things got too real. We hauled out our little tent and a couple of sleeping bags, got a fire going with some newspaper and a bit of lighter fluid we swiped from my dad's shed, and made a pile of junk food that looked like we were preparing for the end of the world. The fire crackled nice and bright, and we just sat there for a long time, soaking it all in. We didn't even talk much once the fire was going. Just kind of sat there, watching the flames jump and twist like they had a life of their own. That's a quiet I still remember. It wasn't dead silence, not really. There was wind in the trees now and then, and the fire gave off its little snaps and pops. But it was empty in a way that made you listen harder. It was sometime around 10 or maybe 11 when it happened. We'd stopped talking, stopped messing around, just sitting there quiet, feeling brave and proud and like we were doing something grown up. And then from somewhere back in the woods came this sound. I can still hear it now if I close my eyes. It was a scream, but not a human one. Not like someone calling for help or yelling in pain. This sound was deeper and sharper, a noise that cut through everything around it. Like the woods themselves held their breath for a second after. Not long, just one single scream, but it was the kind of thing that goes straight to your gut. You don't think, you just feel, cold all over. I didn't know what it was then, just that it didn't belong. I'd heard coyotes before, dogs, even the weird bark of a fox. This wasn't that. I turned and looked at my friend. I could tell he felt the same thing I did. We were too scared to move at first. Then we both scrambled into the tent like it was some kind of safe zone, zipped it up fast, and just sat there, barely breathing. We didn't talk, didn't even whisper. That scream had taken all the fun out of the night. Eventually, he fell asleep. I don't know how. I guess being a kid helps. I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woods again. The black tree line, the firelight dancing on the grass, the sound just hanging there. I laid on my back, staring up at the nylon ceiling of the tent. I watched the glow of the fire flicker through the fabric. It was dimmer now, just little waves of light playing against the tent wall. Then, out of nowhere, the light disappeared. Not slowly, like the fire dying out, but all at once, gone. Then, just as quick, it came back. That was when I knew something had walked between the fire and the tent. There was no other reason for it. The way the light vanished and reappeared. Clean, sudden, like someone had flipped a switch. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing touching the tent. But something had been out there, right outside. I yanked my sleeping bag over my head, heart thudding so loud I thought whatever it was might hear it. I didn't move. I didn't peek. I laid there sweating in my coat and hoodie and hat and sleeping bag, scared I'd suffocate, but more scared of pulling it back and seeing something I couldn't explain. After a while, I don't know how long, maybe 30 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I was burning up. I slowly pushed the sleeping bag down, just enough to breathe, and stared up at the tent again. The light from the fire was still there, faint, but enough to let me know it hadn't gone out completely. Whatever had been there was gone, or hiding. I didn't know which was worse. I laid there like that for another hour, barely blinking, straining to hear anything at all. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no animals, no wind. The woods were dead silent again. Eventually, somehow, I fell asleep. I think it was more like passing out than sleeping. My body just shut down from fear and exhaustion. I woke up to light hitting the side of the tent. That soft, pale yellow kind of morning light that comes through fog and cold air. My friend was already up and outside. I crawled out and looked around. Everything looked normal. The field was empty. The fire had burned itself down to ash and blackened wood. Our snack pile was untouched. No wrappers missing, no signs of animals digging around. Nothing looked out of place. I told him what I'd seen after he fell asleep. We looked around the tent and the fire ring. We checked the area between the trees and our camp. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs that anything had walked through. Just dry grass and the faint scent of smoke. That scream still bothered us, though. It didn't sound like something made up, but it didn't sound like anything we knew either. For a long time, we just figured it was something weird. Something from deep in the woods that people don't talk about much. Maybe a one-off thing. Years passed. We both grew up, moved on, moved away. But every now and then we'd bring it up when we saw each other. Remember that night? Always with a little laugh, but not a full laugh. Not really. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I finally learned what it was. I was home for the holidays, visiting family. One of the neighbors, an old guy who'd hunted that land for decades, came by to drop off some venison for my dad. They started talking, and I overheard them bring up something strange. Panthers, black ones. I leaned in, curious. The old guy said he'd seen one, real clear, just a month before. Walked right across a dirt road early one morning. He wasn't the only one either. A few folks around had stories. No photos, no real proof, but the stories lined up. Even had a few audio recordings. I asked him what they sounded like, and he played one off his phone. It was the same scream. Not like, kinda similar. Not, it reminded me of it. No, it was the same exact kind of scream I heard that night. One sharp, chilling call that made every hair on my arms stand up again. All those years later, my stomach turned. I stood there, remembering that flicker of the firelight disappearing, remembering sweating under the sleeping bag, the silence, the weight of fear I'd felt. Panthers or mountain lions or whatever folks want to call them. Officially, they're not supposed to be in Alabama anymore. Long gone, according to the state. But if you talk to the people who really live there, who spend time in those woods, who walk those old trails and sit out under those stars, they'll tell you different. They're there. Rare, quiet, near impossible to spot unless they want to be. But sometimes, when the timing is just right or wrong, you'll hear them. Just once. One scream. That's all. After that trip home, I looked it up. Read everything I could find. The scream of a panther doesn't sound like a big cat roar. It doesn't sound like anything you'd expect. It's closer to a woman screaming in pain or terror. It echoes in a way that tricks your brain into thinking it's closer or farther than it really is. And they're nocturnal, solitary, smart. If one had been stalking near our camp that night, we wouldn't have known unless it wanted us to. I think back to the way the firelight vanished and came back. How there were no steps, no noises. How nothing was touched. And now it makes sense. That's how a panther moves. Silent, careful, deliberate. It walked through our camp, probably just checking things out. Maybe curious, maybe just passing through. It didn't need food, didn't see us as a threat, and left as quietly as it came. Knowing what it was doesn't make it less scary. Not really. But it makes it real. It grounds the fear in something that walks and breathes and lives in the woods, not in ghost stories or nightmares. It's a different kind of fear, but a deeper one. The woods don't need monsters to be scary. Sometimes they just need to remind you that you're not alone. It was supposed to be a short, relaxing 5-day backpacking trip. My boyfriend and I had met years ago while through hiking the Appalachian Trail, and back then we were both green but determined. We'd learned a lot since. We'd done dozens of trails together, from the Rockies to the Olympic Peninsula. This time, we picked Southern California for the dry weather, open skies, and fewer bugs. Something about the dusty trails and wide, empty land felt right to us. We spent the day before we left in town, wandering through a Whole Foods with too much enthusiasm. It wasn't a long trip, so we didn't care about going light. We bought the fancy cheeses that needed cooler weather, cured meats, salted nuts, chocolate-covered almonds, crackers that came in boxes instead of bags, and even a small bottle of good olive oil. We packed heavy, but it was only 5 days and we felt strong. We told ourselves it would be worth it to eat well and enjoy something a little indulgent while out in the wild. The first day of hiking was beautiful. The trail wasn't popular, but it was known. It snaked along low ridgelines, down into small canyons, and through brushy patches of chaparral. The sun was out but not blistering, and we moved at a good pace. We had filtered water at a small spring not marked on any official map. There were signs of old ranching operations, some rusted wire fencing, metal gates barely holding together, and a few piles of dry manure near old animal enclosures. Nothing recent, just echoes of use. The only sound, apart from the wind and the occasional bird call, was the crunch of our boots and the rustle of brush when a lizard darted across the trail. We made camp the second night at a spot we had scoped out using satellite images weeks earlier. It was tucked back behind a hill, about 30 meters off a dirt service road. It was flat, dry, and surrounded by low shrubs, maybe not the most scenic, but private enough and open enough to catch the last of the sunset. A short walk from camp, just off the road, there was a large metal trough, one of those rusted old kinds used to feed horses or cattle. It was long and heavy, maybe 10 feet in length, and flipped upside down. This weight alone made it feel immovable. There were dents and rust spots all over it, and one side was partially buried in the sandy dirt. It had clearly been there for years. We looked at it and thought the same thing. Let's put our food under it. We figured the weight would keep animals out. There weren't a lot of bears known to roam this far south and this low in elevation, but we weren't taking any chances. There were still raccoons, maybe coyotes. I'd even seen a few reports of feral dogs in the area. Plus, it seemed like the perfect solution. Out of sight, heavy enough to be safe. It wasn't exactly the Leave No Trace approved bear hang, but we weren't in the high Sierra. We thought it was clever, responsible even. We took our 2 food bags, tucked them under the lip of the overturned trough, pushed some brush in front of it to hide it further, and went to bed. The wind picked up that night. It whipped across the flat land, shook the tent a little. We were tired, though, and slept through most of it. At one point, I half woke to what sounded like something moving outside, but it was the kind of half-sleep where you know you're awake but your brain is fuzzy and slow. I didn't sit up, just listened. The wind played tricks. Sometimes it made the brush whisper and sway like footsteps. I waited a few seconds, didn't hear it again, and drifted back off. In the morning, we packed up our sleeping bags, deflated the pads, started boiling water for coffee. It was warm already. The sky was a washed-out blue, pale at the edges, and the sun was just beginning to burn through the early haze. We walked over to get our food. I remember stepping around the little shrubs and feeling happy. Hungry, but happy. We had planned to eat crackers and cheese, a couple hard-boiled eggs we had brought from town, and dried mango. When we pulled out the first bag, it felt light. Too light. At first, we thought maybe the other bag was heavier, but it wasn't. We unzipped them, sat on the ground, and started going through the contents. Half the food was gone. Not everything, just specific things. The cheese, gone. The salami, gone. The dried mango, the chocolate almonds, the bag of mixed nuts, one of the protein bars, the olive oil, all of the good stuff. Left behind was oatmeal, rice, some instant coffee, the hard-boiled eggs, and some powdered hummus. It wasn't even like someone had been in a rush. It looked like they took the time to pick through the bags and take the things that were worth the most. Not in money, no one was going to resell this stuff, but in comfort, in taste. We sat there, just staring for a while. There were no drag marks, no mess. The brush we'd shoved in front of the trough hadn't even been disturbed much. No tracks. The dirt was too dry and hard. But it was obvious this wasn't an animal. No raccoon was going to unzip a bag and pick out the chocolate almonds and leave the oatmeal behind. Whoever did this had taken their time. They knew what they wanted. The weirdest part was that we hadn't seen or heard anyone for days. The dirt road wasn't wide or well used. There weren't tire marks, no recent footprints. We were miles from the nearest town, and we hadn't seen a single person on the trail or from the ridge we camped on the night before. I remember looking around, slowly, thinking back to the night before. That sound I heard, half asleep. It hadn't been the wind. Not entirely. Maybe it had been someone walking. Maybe they'd been waiting, watching. Maybe they saw us stash our food and waited for us to sleep. It gave me a sick feeling in my gut. We didn't talk much as we packed up. I remember that we didn't even eat. Just boiled the water, drank the coffee standing up, and then broke camp. The trail back was slower. We had to think about food. We had enough to get through the day, maybe one more, but it wasn't enough for 3 more nights. Not without stretching it thin and skipping meals. We weren't going to risk that. We'd been lucky that whoever it was didn't take everything. The hike out was mostly silent. The wind had died down, but it felt colder than it should have. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, not because I thought we were being followed, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that we hadn't been alone the night before, that someone had stood in the dark, just out of sight, and watched us walk to that trough like fools. We made it back to the car late that evening. The sun had already dipped behind the western hills, and the temperature dropped fast. I remember my legs aching, the straps of my pack cutting into my shoulders harder than they usually did. I felt heavy in a different way, not tired, but worn out. We sat in the car for a long while before starting it. Didn't say anything, just sat there, looking out at the darkening trailhead, at the way the dust settled on the windshield. We didn't report it. There wasn't anyone to report it to. We hadn't seen another hiker. No ranger station for miles. We didn't even know where to start. Maybe someone lives out there, off-grid, watching the roads. Maybe they wait for people to stash things, then move in and take what they want. Maybe they'd done it before, would do it again. Maybe they were just hungry. Maybe it was just bad luck. But what stuck with me the most wasn't the loss of the food. It was the knowledge that someone had been close, that someone watched us, probably from the brush, and waited. We had gone into the wild thinking we were alone, thinking our experience made us safe. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters or anything supernatural. Just the simple, quiet fact that people can be unpredictable. That sometimes, even when you do everything right, someone else out there can decide to change the rules on you. We haven't talked about it much since. When people ask us about scary moments on the trail, we usually tell stories about bad weather or close bear encounters or dangerous river crossings. But this left a mark. It was a small thing, the loss of some food, but it cracked something in our trust of the wild. Not the wild itself, but the people who move through it, hidden. After that, we never left food out of sight again. Not under rocks, not in bushes, not under troughs. We either carried it or kept it close. We got more careful. We picked campsites that were hard to spot from a distance. We slept a little lighter. We still hike, still camp, but every once in a while, when the sun sets and the brush whispers in the wind, I think about that night. I think about someone crouched low behind the shrubs, waiting for us to sleep, not saying a word, just watching, quiet, patient, and I wonder how long they stood there,